Hey there, Agile Bubblegum, and welcome to another episode of Agile Bytes, the podcast sponsored by Integrity Inspired Solutions, where we build software in an agile manner day in and day out. Folks, I'd like for you to think for a minute about the things we talk about as an Agile community, the things that we value, the outcomes we are hoping to see realized in our teams as we increase their agility. Think about all those good things. When you think about all the good things that being Agile does for a team, now, think about those things. And now let me ask you this. When people call me for agile coaching or to help them with their, whatever you want to call it, the agile transformation or becoming more agile, what do you think they call me for? Out of all the things that popped into your head when I talked about, the benefits of agility, what do you think is the main thing they call me for? Because when a potential client or a current client calls me and wants some help in increasing agility, I always ask why. I always ask what the outcomes are. And you should ask that yourself, by the way, of your organization. Even if you are several years into your agile journey, if you don't know why you did it, if people aren't talking about the outcomes they were hoping to see and then comparing what's happening against those outcomes, go ahead and ask the question anyway. Find out why are we doing this to begin with? It's not a self-evident truism that every company needs to be agile or that every software team needs to be agile. So it's a good question to ask. So I always ask clients this: what are the outcomes? Why are we having this conversation? And with all the different organizations I've worked with, which has been a lot over the years, which has also unfortunately been a lot, only one has ever said anything about market responsiveness. Only one of them has actually said anything about here's the state of the market and we need to be able to adapt rapidly to the changes that are happening. No one else has. Now, this is interesting because if you think about agility, one of the main things, perhaps even the main thing that we think about for agility is adaptiveness, right? There are changing conditions. They don't necessarily have to be market conditions per se. They can be changing conditions of your business. They can be changing regulations. They can be, just the person who needs your software is just changing their mind a lot. I mean, there can be all kinds of scenarios where there's a high rate of change. And agility is our ability to gracefully and efficiently accommodate and harness that change for competitive advantage. But almost nobody asks for that. Almost everybody asks for something about delivery. We're too slow. We consistently miss deadlines. We deliver consistently, but we're not delivering enough. Or we are delivering consistently and it's enough, but the quality is terrible. We are releasing bug after bug into production, with every deployment. It's something about operations for the most part and quality and things like that. Things that agility really doesn't directly address. So that's what I want to talk about today, because I think this is an important topic. It's important to know what agility does and doesn't address, because it's going to affect your value proposition as you talk to organizations. And it's also going to talk about what kinds of things you champion and what kinds of things you advise to them when you're working with organizations or your team, or your spouse or whoever needs to be more agile in your life, I suppose. Part of the ambiguity on this issue, I think, actually comes from the Agile Manifesto itself, because when the Agile Manifesto came out, you have to understand the climate of software development at the time is just software development in general was very dysfunctional. Some might argue still is in a lot of ways. One of the main reasons that I and Travis started Integrity was we specifically wanted to be a software development company free of the rampant dysfunction that we had seen in software development, either software development activity in organizations or software development firms in general. It was very dysfunctional. Traditional project management was applied. Some of you may have heard of waterfall, which it's debatable whether or not that was ever really a thing, but as a phenomenon, it certainly was. Organizations would plan these 3-year-long software projects, do a whole lot of planning up front, a whole lot of requirements gathering up front. They would get all this information, and only then would you start this design process and it would go on forever, and then you would start coding and it would go on forever, and then you would start testing, which in theory would go on forever, but by this point you were usually like a week away from your 3-year deadline, and so testing actually usually happened very rapidly. And then you would deploy the whole thing into production and there would be tons of bugs, and you're off to the races. So this is a pretty dysfunctional way to go about things. So the Agile Manifesto arose as kind of a counter to those working conditions. And those working conditions not only prevented us from building the right thing, but there are all kinds of aspects to those working conditions, right? Like the rigor of big upfront planning and sticking to that project plan, for example, or the doing testing at the very end when it's the highest risk. And so the Agile Manifesto, when it talks about better ways of developing software, of course, it's addressing many of those issues, like sticking to a plan instead of being responsive, right? Or welcoming changing requirements instead of what we used to do, which was have these very hidebound change management processes that made changing requirements very difficult. Because if requirements change, then what happens to your plan, right? And so this very rigid, very iron-bound way of doing software projects, the Agile Manifesto is sort of the counter to that. And because of it, sometimes it begins to wade into territory that addresses things like quality, or it addresses things like speed of delivery, which are not really things we normally put under the Agile umbrella. So I'm not really wanting to get into a big discussion here about what the Agile Manifesto really means, or what it does or doesn't cover, or all the different ramifications. That's an interesting topic. If you would like to talk with me about that, buy me a drink sometime and we can talk about it. It's an interesting topic, and it'd certainly be interesting to unpack, especially once you get into the 12 principles, what is and isn't kind of properly under the domain of quote unquote Agile. So I'm not really going to talk about that. I'm just going to talk about agility, the characteristic of agility in teams, which most of our Agile frameworks are designed to increase. And then I'm going to talk about lean as it is commonly experienced in software development projects. So when we talk about what agility addresses, we are talking about a team's responsiveness to change. Again, that can be changing requirements, that can be changing market conditions, business conditions, the heat death of the universe, right? It's any time the team needs to respond gracefully to a very high rate of change. And this is in contrast, like I said, to our kind of older, more traditional ways of developing software that were very change resistant. We wanted to make change unattractive. We wanted to make it painful. We wanted to make it as hard as possible, because as soon as somebody starts changing, now we have to have these debates about what's in scope and what's out of scope. Now our deadlines are all at risk. Our big project plan for the next 10 years is all at risk. The fixed price that we gave that client is now at risk because there's a change. So we always tried to make change difficult, controlled, something to be afraid of. Whereas agility is like, no, bring it on. If we put the right practices in place for our team, we should be able to adapt to change, and we should want to, right? Because those changes are what take us closer and closer to building the right thing for the environment into which we are going to launch it, right? It's like evolution. Organisms evolve to fit their environment. The ones that don't mutate in the right ways die off. The ones that do pass on their genetic material. And that's how this works, right? So Agile is just very high-speed evolution, right? Our environment is changing, and our software needs to adapt for that changing environment. That's mostly what agility addresses. So when you're talking to an organization and they bring you on as an Agile coach or a Scrum Master or whatever, you want to ferret this out, right? Like, is the issue really that you want to be more adaptive to changing conditions? Because that's what raising your agility buys you, is greater adaptation to changing conditions. And some software just is not that volatile. In fact, I would say that even though almost every software project has unknowns to it, most software projects are not super volatile. There are changes. Every software project has some changes. There's some rate of change, but for a lot of them, it's not huge. When we think about huge rates of change, we think about businesses that are very volatile, or we think about markets that are very volatile, or we think about products that are very innovative, like we've never tried a product like this before, or we are launching a product into the market that is very similar to other products, and we need to figure out the thing that's going to set us apart, right? So we're going to need to try different things to set us apart. That's where Scrum came from, by the way, is that exact environment. So that's what agility addresses. But does all software need agility? Well, no, it doesn't. To give an extreme example, for one client we put together some software that calculated a chain pull force equation. You put in all these variables and it calculated all kinds of things about like how long the chain would need to be, the incline of the chain. This client designed and built conveyor belt systems. So, how much force can a chain exert at a certain length and a certain angle is very important. How volatile is that software really? I mean, it's a pretty niche use, right? The market is not changing very rapidly for chain pulling. The mechanics of chain pulling are not changing drastically anytime soon, right? We're talking about the laws of physics. So when you're building software to help people calculate chain pull force equations, how agile does your team really need to be? I would argue not very. I think something like Scrum would be a huge waste of time for software like that. You just don't need to adapt that much. Now, does that mean there are no unknowns? No, of course not. Does it mean that there will be no changes? Well, there probably will be changes, especially as you're showing it to the people who are going to use it. They may want tweaks to the UI, or, they may have thought of a variable that goes into the equation that they forgot about when you were talking about. So yeah, there's going to be unknowns, there are going to be changes, but the volatility is very low. I hope you can see where I'm going with that, right? And as we look at other software projects that maybe are not quite as, predictable as chain pull force equations, or maybe not as niche, maybe not as, the market is very set, right, for that kind of software. Even projects that are not that way, still, for a lot of projects that we build, we sort of have to figure out, like, how adaptable do we need to be? We're going to need some. Everybody needs some level of agility, but how much, right? Is this really a goal? Is what your organization needs more agility? They may call it agile. They may say agile is what they want, but is it really? Is increasing the adaptability to a volatile environment really what you're after? Now, in some cases it is. In some cases it absolutely is. And there are several software products where that is a huge asset, being able to dynamically respond to feedback quickly that allows you to pivot and get closer to building the right thing after several iterations of trying to get there. Yeah, greater agility is great for that, but not all projects and not all teams and not all organizations need that. A lot of times the things that people call me for are addressed by more of lean thinking as applied to the software development process. Now, I know what some of you are thinking right now, because the Scrum Guide says that Scrum comes from lean thinking. It doesn't. When I talk about the use of lean in software development, I'm talking about things like workflow management. I'm talking about managing our work in progress. I'm thinking about controlling the rate of flow through the different stages that work items have to move through in order to have the most efficient output. I'm talking about identifying our constraint and improving our constraint. I'm talking about the kind of mechanisms that we build in for quality, not just in the flow of our work, but in the product itself, and the different principles around building in quality up front and things like that. Those are not things that increasing agility really addresses. In fact, on occasion, increasing your agility may put some of those things at risk, which may be worth it if that's really what you need. But those are the kinds of things I'm thinking about. And where I'm going with this is what I find in the Agile community is a rather disproportionate amount of trying to increase an organization's agility in order to solve problems for them that are really mostly addressed with workflow management or lean thinking, lean operations as we apply them to software development. Kanban is obviously something that we all think about when we think about this, but not just Kanban. The application of the theory of constraints. I think of Steve Tendon's TameFlow in that regard, just the kinds of things we apply to the workflow. These things are not mutually exclusive from being agile, but they just address a different body of problems. And this is what most organizations are looking for. I don't have hard data on that. I realize anecdotes are not data, but I mean, come on. I think most of us can probably resonate with that, right? In fact, I would even say that this is a pretty high degree of frustration for agile coaches and scrum masters, because they show up at an organization all ready to help them be adaptable with their product, only to find that what the organization really wants is to go faster, right? Or what the organization really wants is to deliver more. And we could argue all day about whether or not organizations should care about that. I actually have a podcast episode on that. Is it okay to want to go faster? But this from a market perspective creates a difficulty for those of us who are in the game of agile coaching or agile working, agile oversight in some form or fashion. Like, you might not be an agile coach. You might be a software developer who is trying to help your team, do things in a more agile way, for example. So we need to figure out what problem set we are really focusing on when we go to an organization. Part of this has to do with your personal market fit. We are seeing a lot of scrum masters and agile coaches getting laid off. It's not that nobody is hiring, it's not the apocalypse, right? Like, nobody wants agile coaches or scrum masters anymore. That's not true. But we are starting to see what I think of as kind of a market correction that looks something like this. Big company A decides that their software development sucks, and they want to be faster. They want to be more efficient. They want to get twice the work done in half the time. And somehow, maybe because of a misleading book title or something they read, they have come to the conclusion that agile is what they need. They read a blog about it or something like that. And so they've done their research, they've done their homework, and you can't read about agility or becoming agile without running into Scrum and or SAFe, right? And so this big organization A comes to the conclusion, we need Scrum, right? Or we need SAFe. And they're a big organization, so they hire tons of Scrum masters, right? Or SAFe masters, or I don't know. I don't know what you call the people who make you do SAFe, but the SAFe dungeon masters. They hire all these people. These people come in and they do their thing. They do what they were trained to do. They do what they were certified to do, which is to get these frameworks up and running that are mostly designed. We can argue about how successful they are, but the intent behind them is to increase an organization's agility. That's not what the organization actually wanted, is it? They didn't want to become more agile. I know that's what they said, and I know that's what their job description says, and I know that's what they hired for, but what they really wanted was to deliver more or deliver faster or have fewer bugs. They wanted operational improvements. They didn't want greater adaptability in the product development process. And so it takes about 2 to 3 years or 5 years or whatever. There's a certain span of time that passes where there's a tension that builds in this organization because the scrum masters are scrumming it up, bags of scrum bags all over the organization, but they're not any faster. Right? They're not delivering any more than they did before. In fact, due to the J curve, they might even be worse in those areas than they were before. And then they're complaining to the scrum masters, hey, you're not improving us. You're not actually making us better. And the scrum masters are saying, what are you talking about? Like, this team is very adaptable. Like, every sprint, we reevaluate the product and we're good to totally pivot next sprint if that's what we needed to do. But the organization never wanted that. They never wanted that to begin with. There was a misalignment on the outcomes that they wanted and the solution that they paid for. So what happens? Well, now these scrum masters are not providing value, or these agile coaches are not providing value, or these damnable SAFe consultants from the pits of hell. That last one might be more accurate, but they're like, just get rid of all these people because they're not doing what we wanted them to do. So it is incredibly important, if you are in this space as an agile coach or as a scrum master or some kind of agile champion, even if it's in an informal way, to figure out, like, what does the organization actually want? What outcomes are they actually focused on? Because it might not be agility. Agility might not be the way to get them there. And you may either want to take your business elsewhere or simply adapt your own focus to more closely align with the things that they need or the things that they think they need. And if you think they need more agility, then you should say that, right? And ultimately, that's what this comes down to is, are we doing the right things to achieve the outcomes that we need? And the first step to seeing if that's the case, to doing the empirical studies to see if that's the case, is to be aligned on those outcomes. Don't come into an organization trying to increase their responsiveness when what they want is to go faster, right? Or what they want is fewer bugs in production. Greater agility is not going to help them with that. Not directly, anyway. I don't want to give the impression that these things are opposed to each other, right? Lean operations and agility are not oppositional polarities to each other. It's just they're focused on different things. They're focused on increasing different characteristics. And so you want to make sure that if you're in this space, it's very important that whether it's your team or your organization or whoever you're trying to work with, that first and foremost, you all get on the same page about what the outcomes are that you're wanting from this effort, and then you align what you are recommending to the outcomes, and the practices and the experiments that you try and the measurements that you do all need to be aligned against that common set of outcomes. And maybe increasing agility is exactly what you need, but it might not be. It might be something else altogether. So take time to get aligned on those outcomes, and then make sure that you are planning and doing and checking and acting around those outcomes. Thanks, everyone, for listening to Agile Bites. Agile does sometimes bite, but we don't think it always has to. If you enjoyed what you heard today, don't forget to like and subscribe to this podcast on whatever platform you happen to be using. And if you can, leave us a comment, because we'd love to hear your feedback. What things would you like to hear about? What things did you hear that were valuable to you today? You can also head over to integrityinspired.com to sign up to our email list. But that's all for today, folks. We'll see you next time.